The Denver City Council made national headlines this week over its unanimous approval to amend how petty and quality of life offenses are categorized in the city's criminal code. This Monday's vote reduced the maximum sentence to 60 days while removing fines for crimes like trespassing, urinating in public, and even minor assaults. Penn, you're one of our two esteemed lawyers at the table here. What do these changes mean? We heard a little bit about how this would affect the homeless and immigrants, but is it more than that?
I think it is. I think from a big picture perspective, Denver, like a lot of Western communities, has a number of laws on the books that quite frankly are outdated and irrelevant and probably shouldn't be there anymore. Many of them aren't enforced anyway. So I think the council took a very brave and appropriate step in reducing the penalties and changing how some of these offenses are classified. You know, when I was in the legislature, we used to talk about all of these primary offenses that we thought were subterfuge to exact the driving while black policy. And so in many of these instances, some of these charges historically have been used by police as an excuse just to deal with the homeless or to deal with crowds or groups they deem undesirable. So some of the selective enforcement by reducing the penalties is good, particularly as they impact the homeless. There's clearly an intent here to try to pull Denver out of the crosshairs of ICE and the Trump administration's enhanced enforcement with regard to immigration, particularly with regard to people who are in the country legally and have papers, because there's not always a discrimination in enforcement by ICE between people who are properly documented and people who are not. So City Council was clear in not wanting city code to be used as a pretext or basis for initiating deportation proceedings and some other enforcement actions. And again, I applaud the city for doing that. I think that's an appropriate thing to do.
Hans, you're our other esteemed lawyer at the table, and you have an expertise in these areas. What did you think of the changes handed out by the council?
Not bad. I think the council could have gone further, and I actually think that the mayor's office could have gone further as well. But we have been encouraging the mayor's office and city council to address this issue for about 4 or 5 months. Coming at it from the perspective of the sort of unintended impacts for immigrant communities, largely people who have status, who then end up being deportable for minor sort of quality of life crimes, particularly under a Trump administration where we have this mass deportation dragnet that Trump is trotting out. And that it just is wise public policy to sort of extract municipal functions and functions of city government from those of immigration enforcement. So that's where we were approaching it from. But there's obviously bigger issues, right? You know, there's homeless communities, there's other targeted communities historically for these sort of minor municipal offenses. So it's a good move, and it's a good move in the right direction. I think the devil in the details I'm not terribly happy with. I think there's a couple things I would have liked to have seen modified, done a little bit differently, and maybe a little bit more data collected on that, and maybe a little bit more of a push for a little bit more comprehensive reform. But as an overall move, as an initial restructuring of what was basically a monolithic sentencing structure that was all the same, it's a step in the right direction.
Patty, I think some of this was meant to, as Penn mentioned, to get City of Denver off the radar of ICE, at least the specific cases off ICE's radar. But do these changes put an even brighter spotlight on Denver as a sanctuary city?
Oh, I don't think the spotlight has been dimmed on Denver one bit, so I don't think we need to worry about it. In the meantime, it was a smart move to really come up with a solution for some of this. Let's also remember that this sentencing reform bill added hate crimes, that you could now be punished for a hate crime. So in some ways it also strengthened the law that way. I think to get urinating in public, unless it's on 420 in Civic Center Park, but to get some of these crimes off the table is a good move. I was a little concerned about what I read about domestic violence, but I looked into it and it turns out if it's domestic violence with literal violence, with physical assault, it immediately moves up to the top level. So that concern is moved away. I think it was a good move so far.
Mike, what do you think of the moves? There's a lot of different topics here between immigration, homeless, sentence reform. What do you think?
Well, it sounds like City Council was doing this, it was gearing this towards immigrants and looking at the Trump administration and ICE and and I think Penn makes a good point of them wanting to avoid being the reason that some kind of action is taken against someone. It's kind of too bad that they that the city council was all of a sudden inspired to do this possibly because of the Trump administration and his immigration crackdown, when there was a perfectly good reason to do something like this for years, which was to stop screwing over poor people with exorbitant fines. And let me explain. Here's what happens often. By the way, fining a homeless guy who has no job is a lot like sentencing someone to 600 years in prison. I mean, it's a point, right? But here's what happens is that there's and this goes on in municipalities all over the state and all over the country, is that exorbitant fines for small offenses, cities use these as cash cows, but what happens is you find someone who can't afford to pay the fine, they don't pay the fine, now there's a warrant for their arrest for not paying the fine, now they get arrested for that, they're back in court, now there's another fine. And so what this starts a downward cycle, that if you're at the margin, right, there's two places you can go. You can either start slowly building your way back up, or one large expense comes along, and in fact, the Census Bureau shows that the typical American is about $400 away from not being able to cover an emergency expense. So, and we saw this a couple years ago when the ACLU brought forward some legislation that requires municipalities to stop jailing people for not being able to pay fines. So what you're really going to do here is they may inadvertently, even though they may be sticking their thumb in Trump's eye with this, they may inadvertently actually help a few people living at the margins come up out of the margins by not inadvertently getting, frankly, screwed by the city over some exorbitant fine.